this is going to be a quick video. We're just going to do an overview of linguistics, what it is, and what you should know about it at the outset. So really quickly, what is linguistics? The scientific study of language. Let me get a color here. It's the scientific study of language. So it is a science. Oftentimes, you'll see it described or talked about as an art, or you might receive a Bachelor of Arts degree for a linguistics program, but we generally consider it a science, at least as well. It involves the analysis of the form of language, meaning of language, and the context of language. So the social or political or cultural context that form and meaning might exist in. Historically, it's actually a very long-living sort of field of study. From Wikipedia, we've got this little gem here. The earliest activities in the documentation and description of language have been attributed to the 6th century BC Indian grammarian Panini, who wrote a formal description of the Sanskrit language in his Astadhyayi. I probably butchered that. And I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be a retroflex N, but we'll be fine. I'm sure that it has been attributed to this individual. However, it actually goes back a lot longer than that. In the Sumerian Empire, or the Sumerian sort of culture, it's probably better to say, there's widespread bilingualism between Sumerian and Akkadian, and Sumerian and Akkadian were very well described historically in grammars and lexica by the Sumerians and the Akkadian people, especially as Sumerians started to die. So much older than the 6th century BC. Later works in Greek and Latin, which many of these would be later than the 6th century BC, and then later than Sumerian and Akkadian grammars are very common. They talked about these later Greek and Latin works, very well known, and this is probably where a lot of our minds go to. Other languages don't have a very long history of being described and documented and cataloged. The ancient Egyptian language its older and newer forms were well understood, even as the older forms of the ancient Egyptian language began to not to be spoken. They were understood historically and cataloged, and people took pains to preserve them. Later, we will also get grammars of Chinese and Korean languages like that. But people have been talking about language for a very long time. In the West, a lot of our interest in language has been philosophical from a semantics point of view. If you read Aristotle, a lot of what he'll talk about is the philosophy of semantics, so class inclusion, things like that, categories. This whole section of his works talks about categories. So the meaning of language has also been very important, but the form of language has also been very well described from a very early period. Linguistics is, as the science of language, it's related to a lot of other fields like speech pathology. This concentrates on helping individuals who have problems in communication using language. Literary criticism, so the description of literary forms. Semiotics, the study of signs and signing systems, whether they're language or linguistic systems or not. Translation and interpretation. This is a little bit more obvious, translation being sort of the written form of moving written forms from one language to another, and interpretation being more spoken. So somebody will speak and you'll interpret for them to another individual in a spoken way usually. But also logic and philosophy have always made extensive use of linguistics, and linguistics takes into account logic and philosophy. Some interesting work being done currently, at least that I'm interested in, takes into account how language can interfere with our understanding of logical relationships between things. Major subdisciplines of linguistics include historical linguistics. This is the study of language as it changes over time and the relationships between languages. So people might study how Spanish came down from Latin, or how modern Hebrew was revived from biblical Hebrew, or also something as simple as how people talk differently now versus 20 years ago. We also have the study of syntax, which is the ordering of words and the relationships of words and phrases around each other, so larger linguistic constructs. Morphology, the study of forms of words, so the endings that we put on words, how we make new words, things like that. Semantics, which would be the study of meaning in language. Pragmatics, which would be the study of how language is used in social contexts. So, for example, in English, you might say, can you pass the salt? You might not literally want to know if an individual can pass the salt, but you would use that in a social context in order to get somebody to do something to pass the salt. Phonology, which is a study of systems of sounds in language, so which sounds occur in which languages. Phonetics, which is more the sort of the physics of how sounds are produced. Discourse analysis, this is the study of extensive amounts of discourse, how people keep track of information, how people process, say, a story or a lecture or something, anything really longer than a sentence, how that's processed. And we also have disciplines like psycholinguistics, study of the psychology of linguistics, neurolinguistics, the neurological basis for language understanding and production. We also have things like sociolinguistics, so sociological implications and uses of linguistics, and how our language use depends on social context. So a lot of subdisciplines and areas of study. There are also a lot of approaches to linguistics. We have a lot of tools and methodologies that are used, like we talked about psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic tools. We'll use neurological tool or neuroscience tools as well, and psychological tools as well. So for example, you could use an fMRI, take an MRI of a person while producing language. We'll also use things like surveys that are often used in psychology, eye tracking data, things of that sort. Evolutionary models, so there's an evolutionary sort of subset of linguistics that views language as an evolved process and seeks to understand its place within evolution. Surveys, I think we already talked about that with psychological tools. We'll also use corpora and computational techniques, so large amounts of linguistic data oftentimes, but not always, written data that can be processed by a computer. And corpus will be any large amount of linguistic data, so if you have a large number of texts stored in a database in a computer, that would be a corpus. And we have very large corpora that are often used for linguistic experiments and whatnot in order to study written language very often. We'll also have corpora of spoken language in the form of audio files, and this can be studied in a very similar way. We also have statistical tools for analysis of texts, and we can analyze probabilities of, for example, texts being from the same individual. That would be authorship. We do other cool things like analyze statistically the effectiveness of a reading strategy, or we can talk about the mathematically talk about the effectiveness or the language skill of an individual. And we've also had this historically important form of introspection, which has been it's not really used very much anymore, but has been historically important, where native speakers of a language will ask themselves sort of what's going on in their minds or what they consider to be correct or incorrect. Nowadays, what we try to do instead of sort of sitting there and asking yourself what is considered a correct or incorrect form, we're more likely to go out and ask a variety of native speakers who are not involved directly with the study, so who aren't study authors, whether a form would be correct or incorrect, rather than just sitting on our armchairs and thinking about forms of language for ourselves. That way we can get the perspective of many speakers in language. But historically, introspection by the linguist, the actual linguist involved, has been a very important part of linguistics. And the applications of linguistics, so you have tools like Siri and Alexa and machine translation like Google Translate, but also other things like if you've ever toyed around with Trados or any other machine translation, that would be used. Counterterrorism, so we use linguistics in order to process large amounts of data and find leads for example, counterterrorism. That's a very specific application of linguistics. Evaluating understanding of individuals in legal context and in other contexts, like in a school, you would want to know if an individual understands what's on a test. So that would be in a teaching context down here. Authorship, other discourse analysis, historical analyses of texts, and teaching. So this is both teaching using linguistics for clarity of teaching in teaching a lot of subjects, and also teaching second languages. Also some more some smaller applications, some less common applications that you'll get in, for example, the use of Navajo and Welsh as cryptologically during World War II would be good examples of that.